Welcome to EKO201E, Economics. I'm Chris Hannum. This is Lecture 8 on the costs of taxation. On Lecture 7, we introduced a phenomenon or a concept called producer surplus, consumer surplus, total surplus that we used to explain how good the economic activity in a market was. And we demonstrated using those concepts what it is exactly that economists mean when they say that market allocations of goods and services are usually good. It's usually good because they maximize total surplus. Now, today what we want to do is to utilize that same model, the model of supply and demand, utilized in welfare economics to calculate total surplus for a policy question. And that policy question is the impact of a tax. Here, the tax we'll look at will be an excise tax, so it's a tax on a particular product. Now, to review from Chapter 6, where we also introduced the concept of a tax in the supply and demand model, but used that tax to explain incidence and where the burden of the tax falls, how it causes a difference between the price that buyers pay, the price that sellers sell, and the price difference between both of those prices, and what the market equilibrium price would be in the absence of the tax. What we didn't do in Chapter 6 was explain whether that tax, by creating a wedge between the price that buyers pay and price that sellers receive, was good or bad, or made an economic outcome worse, or made an economic outcome better than it otherwise would be. Now, we'll apply these concepts, total surplus, producer surplus, and consumer surplus, to do exactly that. But the tax that we'll look at will work exactly the same as the tax that we had in Chapter 6, where the tax creates what we call a wedge between the price that buyers pay and the price that sellers receive, such that we have one single quantity in our market equilibrium, a quantity of goods that are bought and sold, but we don't have a single price. We have two different prices, a buyer price and a seller price, where the buyer price is equal to the seller price plus the tax. We also demonstrated already in Chapter 6 that one of the effects of an excise tax on a product, in addition to just creating this wedge between buyer and seller price, is that this tax that we implement reduces the quantity that are bought and sold in the market. So the presence of a tax, equilibrium quantity is less. Now in this chapter, we won't make a distinction between whether the buyer, technically speaking, pays the tax, because that would result in a pseudo shift in a demand curve, or whether the supplier, technically speaking, pays the tax, because that would result in a pseudo shift in the supply curve, because as we showed then, it doesn't have any implication as far as the difference between buyer price and seller price, what buyer price and seller price will ultimately be, or what the market transaction quantity will going to be, nor the incidence of that tax between buyers and sellers. It ultimately did not matter whether the buyer or the seller was technically responsible. So what we'll do is to model this tax not as a shift in the demand curve or a shift in the supply curve, although it could be very much like either one of those, but simply as creating a wedge, a gap between the supply curve and the demand curve at equilibrium. It's a vertical gap, a gap between the prices at a single quantity. Now we'll create a single hypothetical market here in which we will apply a tax with the price, again, on the vertical axis, the quantity of the good that's bought and sold on the horizontal axis. We'll have a standard sort of downward sloping demand curve. That demand curve slopes down because of the law of demand. And a standard sort of upward sloping supply curve. Supply curve slopes up because of the law of supply. At all else equal, as the price of a good rises, the quantity that businesses are willing to supply, they would like to supply, will increase. Now, say if this is a competitive functioning market, nothing interferes with this market we would expect to naturally tend toward equilibrium. And that will give us this natural equilibrium quantity, say of 100. It will give us this natural equilibrium price, say, of 20. Again, in the absence of any kind of shock to this market, there will be a gravity that pulls this market to this equilibrium price and quantity combination. Now, what we want to assume is in this hypothetical market, suppose that the government imposes a tax, and that tax is exactly equal to 10 per unit of this good that's sold. That tax that we impose will create a wedge between demand and supply. So we'll need to find the quantity along the horizontal axis where the gap between demand and supply is equal to exactly 10. And that will be just about right here. So right here will be our market equilibrium price and quantity combination with a market equilibrium price of 20, a market equilibrium quantity of 100. Again, there will be a natural logic to the market, a gravity in the market that in the absence of any kind of shocks will lead the market price back to 20 if for whatever reason it's higher or for whatever reason it's lower. Now, suppose hypothetically that in our market, the government imposes a tax on this product. The government imposes a tax exactly equal to 10 per unit. And that means that whenever a buyer purchases this good, they'll need to pay 10 more than whatever it is that the seller receives. So for any quantity that's bought and sold, for our new market equilibrium in the presence of a tax, we need to find some quantity where the gap or the wedge between supply and demand is exactly equal to 10, because 10 is the size of our tax. Here, the gap is less than 10. Here, the gap is more than 10. So those quantities would not be consistent in this market with a tax of 10. In this market, see this point right here, this quantity, a quantity of 80, gives us a gap between supply and demand, which is exactly equal to 10. With a buyer price of 25 and a seller price of 15. Now, this is very much like what we described in the 6th lecture, except that here we've just assumed a wedge that must be exactly equal to the size of the tax, instead of shifting the demand curve by exactly 10, which would give us the same result, or by shifting the supply curve by exactly 10, which would also give us exactly the same result. Now, if we have this tax equal to exactly 10, and we know that the quantity that we buy and sell drops from 100 to 80, we can calculate what producer surplus is with the tax and how it compares to producer surplus in the absence of the tax. We can calculate what consumer surplus is in the presence of the tax and what consumer surplus was without the tax. First note, use the red here. Without a tax, the producer surplus will be the area under a price of 20 above the supply curve out to the original quantity of 100. That's this whole triangle here. Now, our consumer surplus without a tax would have been the area under the demand curve and above the original price of 20, all the way out to the original quantity that was bought and sold of 100. It's this whole triangle here. And of course, without the tax, consumer surplus and total surplus combined, this whole shaded area is total surplus. Now, with the tax, we noted our sellers are only going to receive 15. If sellers only receive 15, then they don't get as much producer surplus for each unit that they do sell. Also, they're not going to be selling 100 units anymore in the presence of the tax. There aren't as many buyers who are willing to pay 25, so they're only able to sell 80. And now total producer surplus is the area under the seller price, but above the supply curve. Now just this triangle here. part of what was producer surplus, this rectangle here, this triangle here, are lost. These are no longer part of producer surplus in the presence of the tax, though they were in the absence of the tax. Now let's look at the demand side, consumer surplus. Consumers are now paying a higher price, and consumers are not buying as many units of the good. Consumers are also buying only 80, and consumers are paying 25 for it. So each consumer who still buys the good is less happy with the purchases that they've made. So now consumer surplus in the presence of the tax is the area, again, under the demand curve, out to the quantity they actually consume, but above the buyer price, the price that buyers in this market actually pay. And that's this shaded area here. Now, consumers have also lost because of the tax. Consumers have lost this area, which used to be part of consumer surplus, but now is not. And they've lost this triangle, which used to be part of consumer surplus, but now is not. Now, in the presence of a tax, total surplus isn't just going to be equal to producer surplus plus consumer surplus anymore. Before, that's all there was, but now there's something else. If we have a tax, we should also consider government revenues. If we assume that government revenues are spent for useful things, they're used to build roads, they're used to pay for medical services, things like this. Government services may be equally valuable to us as consumption, or equally valuable to us as money that we have in our pocket. So now there's a certain area on this graph that illustrates the amount of revenue that this tax is able to raise. There's a tax per unit of 10, exactly 10 per unit, and we sell exactly 80. So the revenue that's raised from that tax is the tax per unit times the quantity sold. 10 times 80, 800. And on the graph, that's a rectangle with height equal to the tax and base equal to the quantity sold. So this area here, this rectangle, this is still part of total surplus. It's not part of consumer surplus or producer surplus, but it is part of total surplus because it's part of government revenues. Now, those are the only three components of total surplus in our model, in our explanation, and we still have a piece missing that was part of the original total surplus in the case without a tax, but is no longer part of total surplus once we do have a tax. And that's the tip of the triangle right here. Now these revenues, these government revenues, this rectangle, this is lost by consumers and it's lost by producers, but it's not lost for the whole of society. It's not lost for total surplus. It's merely transferred. In the same way that raising the price of a good could cause a transfer from consumers' surplus to producers' surplus, make producers better off while making consumers worse off. Here we're making consumers and producers worse off while making the government or the recipients of government services better off. This triangle right here, at the tip of that triangle, isn't transferred to anyone. This represents transactions that did occur without a tax, the 81st unit sold, the 88th unit sold, but transactions that do not occur once the tax is imposed in this market. So for each of these units, the 81st unit, the 88th unit, the 99th unit, consumers have a willingness to pay somewhere between 25 and 20. They would have been willing to pay at least 20, but they're not willing to pay 25. So if they have to pay 25, our new buyer price, in the presence of the tax, they don't purchase the good. They keep their money instead. So they don't receive any surplus from purchases of the good because they don't purchase the good at all. And all of these units here, they're units that if the price was 20, producers would have been willing to produce and would have been willing to sell because their cost is less than 20. But their cost is greater than 15, which is now the seller price that they're receiving, this PS, in the presence of the tax. So none of these sellers are willing to produce. So these 81st through 99th, 100th units, these are goods which are never produced and never sold because of the tax. This is the source of what we call deadweight loss that results from the tax. Deadweight loss is any kind of a reduction in surplus for either consumers or producers that is not transferred to anyone else, but simply lost for society as a whole. It's a deadweight loss because it's a loss that is not matched with a corresponding gain somewhere else. And for each of these units, the willingness to pay from the consumer is greater than the cost to the producer. So each of those units should have been produced, should have been consumed, would have made society as a whole better off, would have increased welfare, would have increased total surplus if they had been bought and sold. However, because of the tax, they're never produced, and that potential surplus is lost. As a result, we would say that this outcome, in which because of the tax we produce only 80 instead of 100, is inefficient. We're not maximizing the total surplus, not maximizing the welfare in this economy. Now, given that we've established that taxes create deadweight loss, and we know that the reason that taxes exist, first and foremost, is to raise revenue for the government. There's no other way for the government to raise revenue, even if it causes our economic pie to be smaller. And the government may impose certain taxes in order to redistribute income and make our economic outcomes more fair. So the government may have certain revenue needs, and we may be interested in understanding why deadweight loss for certain taxes might be higher than it is for other taxes. So what determines the size of deadweight loss? Ideally, if we're going to choose an optimal tax policy, we might choose a tax policy that did the least damage to our economy. That might be a tax policy that had the lowest associated deadweight loss, or the least inefficiency that's generated. What determines whether the deadweight loss is large or small? Ultimately, it's elasticities, both the price elasticity of demand and the price elasticity of supply. Both of them, not just one. As you can see in the example, our deadweight loss, if supply is very inelastic, as you can see illustrated with a steep supply curve, that triangle representing deadweight loss at the edge of that wedge, that triangle is very small because the quantity hasn't changed by very much in our market when we imposed this relatively large tax. This is because suppliers with very inelastic supply, in this example, are still willing to produce almost the same quantity that they were willing to produce before. And even if consumers aren't willing to demand very much with a higher price due to the tax, because the quantity doesn't change very much, there's very little deadweight loss associated. Most of the burden in this case falls on suppliers. Now, again, focusing on the supply elasticity, suppose we use the same demand curve for an example, but now we allow supply to be elastic as opposed to inelastic. Now, suppliers aren't willing to produce as much with the big drop in price that they see, the big drop in seller price relative to the original equilibrium. We have the same size of a wedge, although it might look when you compare those two graphs that the wedge isn't the same, but the vertical size of the wedge is the same. It's the same tax that's being imposed, but the size of the deadweight loss triangle with a elastic rather than inelastic supply is much, much larger. Here illustrated by a flatter rather than steeper supply curve. So all else equal, if supply is inelastic, deadweight loss will be small. If supply is elastic, not paying any attention yet to demand, deadweight loss will be large. It will lead to a large decrease in overall market quantity at equilibrium. A lot will be not produced because of the tax, therefore deadweight loss will be large. Next, to look at the impact of the elasticity of demand. Suppose we have an ordinarily sort of unitary elasticity of supply, not particularly steep supply curve, not particularly flat. And we'll keep it the same in both examples. But now it's our demand curve that's very steep. When our demand curve is very steep or demand is very inelastic, consumers are not very responsive to changes in the price. And when the price rises as a result of a tax being imposed on this good, consumers still are willing to buy almost the same amount that they were willing to buy before. So now we create a large wedge, a large gap between supply and demand, but it causes a small drop in quantity, and therefore it causes a small deadweight loss triangle at the edge of that wedge there. If we take the same example, same supply curve, same size of a tax, but now we allow demand to be elastic, so it's flatter, and consumers are more responsive to increases in the price. You can see the same wedge, that is the same vertical distance between the supply curve and the demand curve, but a much larger deadweight loss triangle. In extreme cases, we could look at both a very elastic demand and a very elastic supply, and then we would have an even greater degree of overall market responsiveness to the imposition of this tax, and an even greater increase in deadweight loss. Suppose we look at those specific goods that we talked about in the chapter on elasticity, lecture 5. The specific pairs of goods that we use to compare elasticities of demand. Look at breakfast cereal versus sunscreen. Which of those should we tax if we want to create a smaller deadweight loss? Which of those, a tax on which of those would create a larger deadweight loss? As we just mentioned, the deadweight loss from a tax would be larger if we taxed the good that has many substitutes, therefore a high elasticity of demand, a high price elasticity of demand. In this case, that's breakfast cereal. Breakfast cereal has a high price elasticity of demand because it has many substitutes. Therefore, a tax on breakfast cereal would create a lot of deadweight loss. In the case of sunscreen, on the other hand, sunscreen has very few, if any, substitutes. Therefore, the price elasticity of demand for sunscreen is very low. As a result, if we were to tax sunscreen, this would not create very much deadweight loss at all. And if we were to choose an optimal tax policy in order to raise revenues without creating very much deadweight loss, we would want to put higher taxes on sunscreen and lower taxes on breakfast cereal. Our second case, look at hotel rooms in the short run versus hotel rooms in the long run. Actually, hotel rooms are a specific type of product that is very common to see excise taxes levied on at the local level, the city level. City governments tend to do this because hotel rooms are paid for by people who don't live in the city, therefore don't vote in mayoral elections. As a result, cities around the world tend to like to raise those taxes as opposed to taxes that are actually paid by people in those cities. Now, if we have hotel rooms in the short run, we already mentioned that in the short run, demand elasticities are low. So the responsiveness of consumers in the short run is also pretty low. And demand elasticities for consumers in the long run would be higher. But this also, especially in the case of hotel rooms, is very important for supply. The supply of hotel rooms is very inelastic in the short run, but very elastic in the long run, just like demand is. So in the long run, we might see a very high deadweight loss as people avoid coming to our city for conventions or tourism, relative to the deadweight loss in the short run, where we had the same number of hotels that we originally had. We didn't have hotel projects that were discontinued or abandoned, or hotels that were converted into some other property type. And people continued with their existing plans to take vacations, organize conventions, and things like that. So a tax that might look like a relatively good way to raise revenue in the short run with relatively low deadweight loss might not look like a good way to raise revenue in the long run because it could generate a much larger deadweight loss. And then our third case, look at groceries, that's food products, versus meals at fancy restaurants. Now the distinction here is that groceries are a necessity. First, it's a broadly defined good with few substitutes, but it's also a necessity. It's something that everybody needs to buy some amount of in order to survive. Fancy restaurant meals are not. Fancy restaurant meals are a luxury. They're something you can do without if the price rises too high and you can't afford as many. As a result, groceries are the one in this particular case we would expect to have a low price elasticity of demand. And we would expect meals at fancy restaurants to have a high price elasticity of demand. As a result, taxing meals at fancy restaurants would create a lot of deadweight loss. Taxing groceries, on the other hand, would not create a lot of deadweight loss. The implication here, if we want to design our tax system specifically in order to reduce deadweight loss, to make our economy as efficient as it can be, given our need to raise tax revenues, the implication is that we should tax groceries instead of meals at fancy restaurants, or we should tax necessities instead of luxuries. Now, given that our other goal for the economy isn't just efficiency, we also care about fairness and equity, we might not want to raise taxes on groceries very high, even though it wouldn't create very much deadweight loss. We might prefer to keep taxes on groceries low and tax things like luxuries at a higher rate, not for the goal of efficiency, because that kind of a tax policy seems to be inefficient, but for the goal of equity or equality or fairness. For our next question, we've already established, given deadweight losses are created by imposing taxes on products, imposing taxes on income, etc. It's generally not possible for us to raise a lot of tax revenue in such a way that we don't interfere in some way with the efficiency of the economy. But what we can also point out is that first, different tax rates on different products generate different deadweight losses, so we could organize our tax system in such a way that it would minimize deadweight loss by changing which products we taxed. Also, that as we increase the tax on any given product, the deadweight loss that we create won't increase linearly with the tax. It won't increase linearly with the tax revenue that we generate. So we can look at what an optimal, given that we want certain things from our government. We want our government to be able to purchase certain things. We want our government to be able to provide certain redistribution of income services for us. We can look at whether or not for any amount of money that's raised by the government, assuming that it's raised in the most efficient possible way, whether it was worthwhile. That is, whether the spending gives us enough benefit that it's worthwhile for us to impose this additional inefficiency on our economy. And if we could calculate those things, the inefficiency that came with each additional amount of money raised and the benefit that came from each additional amount of money raised, we could determine what the optimal size of government would be. Now, for this example, we want to focus specifically on the tax on labor income. Tax on labor income is a particularly large portion of most governments' overall tax revenues in most countries around the world. These can be framed as income taxes or payroll taxes. So tax on labor income in countries such as the United States or most of Western Europe averages around 40% once we incorporate a variety of different taxes into one aggregated tax. And it's critical to us to understand for that purpose, to know whether we're raising the right amount of revenue or whether our government is the right size or not. It's critical for us to understand exactly what is the deadweight loss that's created by the tax that we impose on labor supply, the tax that we impose in the labor market rather than a product market. And that depends, as we've just illustrated, it depends on what the elasticity is. If the elasticity of labor is very low, as the elasticity of labor's supply, critically, is very low, then the deadweight loss that's associated with this particular very important tax would also be low. We'd create a certain wedge without decreasing the number of jobs, decreasing the amount of employment in the labor market at equilibrium by very much, and wouldn't create very much deadweight loss. On the other hand, if we estimated that labor supply was more elastic, we would create a much larger deadweight loss triangle there at the edge of our wedge for the same size tax or for the same size wedge. The unfortunate thing is that economists don't ever really agree about how elastic labor supply is. We try to estimate this using data from the labor market, get empirical estimations of labor supply elasticity. It depends critically on what type of people we're surveying and what time frame, of course, we're surveying them over. Find that most people respond very, very little to changes in the wage, with changes in their decisions to work or not to work, or to work longer hours or shorter hours. And there may even be some people who respond to lower wages by trying to work longer hours in order to be able to pay their rent, in order to be able to buy enough food for their families, etc. But there is another certain class of people that have more options to not work, other things to do with their time instead of work, who might be more responsive to changes in the wage and might have a higher labor supply elasticity as a result. The question is whether the marginal workers who might enter the labor market as a result of a higher wage, or the marginal workers that might be driven out of the labor market as a result of a change in the labor income tax, are those with higher labor supply elasticities or those with lower labor supply elasticities. We find that for many classes of individuals, chiefly adults above the age of 24, but below the age of 60, including men and unmarried women, labor supply elasticity is very low. But other people who don't fit into that category, including married women, and here women with children, this should include unmarried women with children as well, children themselves, teenagers and young adults who might otherwise be in education and might be living with their parents, and senior citizens, those over the age of 65, who might make a decision about whether or not to continue to work or whether or not to retire, depending on the wage. Those groups of people have been empirically estimated by economists who gather data and what have you to have much higher labor supply elasticities than those other groups of people. So, men between the ages of 24 and 60, they may have a labor supply elasticity of 0.1, very low labor supply elasticity. And if they were the only ones that paid this payroll tax, well, then the deadweight loss associated with this tax would be very low. But other groups of people, such as married women with children, teenagers, senior citizens, they have much higher labor supply elasticities, maybe a labor supply elasticity of 2 or of 2.5. And if predominantly when we impose a tax in this market and reduce the wage that workers are getting to keep, predominantly we may be driving out those workers as they're the first to drop out, while other types of workers remain. So we may see those workers as the marginal workers determining how much deadweight loss our tax policy creates. And we may find that the payroll tax, in fact, generates a lot of deadweight loss. Next, if we made that assumption, or if we estimated empirically that the deadweight loss associated with this most important of taxes, the payroll tax, the deadweight loss was low, because labor supply elasticity was low, then we would determine that we could raise tax revenues efficiently. We might be better off with a large government. On the other hand, if we estimate that the marginal worker, rather than the average worker, has quite a high labor supply elasticity, then we would estimate that the deadweight loss associated with the tax was large. If the deadweight loss associated with the most important tax is large, then we would say that probably the government should be small, since raising tax revenues creates so much inefficiency in our economy. And now, this particular distinction, and this distinction comes about because of how economists gather and analyze data, is one of the key reasons why economists can't simply agree on just about any policy prescription. For us to agree on how big government should be doesn't just depend on how much economists think people need government services. It depends on what economists believe the elasticity of labor supply is, which of those research agendas they agree with. Now, next we want to look at, for a given excise tax, what happens when we change its size? This also helps to inform whether we believe that the deadweight loss associated with our total tax burden for our economy, therefore the deadweight loss we create and the inefficiency we create is large or small, and whether our government should be large or our government should be small. So if we raise one tax and we lower another, assuming that these goods have similar elasticities, if we raise one tax and lower another, what would the net impact be on total deadweight loss, therefore the additional inefficiency that's added by all of our taxes into the economy? So what we want to look at is how deadweight loss varies with the size of the tax. So suppose we have an initial tax in this market, do see here, of T. And we want to look at what the change in the deadweight loss would be if we take that tax of T and double it. Here our tax is 10. We'll double it to a tax of 20. If we start with a tax of T, we go to a tax of 2 times T, we get more than double our deadweight loss. If we increase our tax still further, now to triple our original tax, 3 times T, or 30 instead of 10 or instead of 20, we'll increase that wedge between supply and demand even further. Now the wedge is equal to 30. We're going to see a further decrease in the quantity that we buy and sell in this market, and from Q1 to Q2, now to Q3. And now we increase the size of that deadweight loss triangle with a larger tax. It's a new bigger pink triangle that you can see, which is more than triple what the original deadweight loss was as we triple the size of the tax. No, deadweight loss, as we increase the size of a specific excise tax in a specific market, increases exponentially with the size of the tax. Now, what happens to tax revenues? Since we're not so much interested in how much deadweight loss is generated per unit of tax, we're interested in how much deadweight loss is generated per unit of revenue. Since the purpose of our tax system is to generate the most revenue that we can, potentially with the least inefficiency that we can have. What happens to total revenues as we increase the size of the tax? As you can see, that yellow rectangle there, if our tax is equal to size T, that yellow rectangle is equal to Q1 times T. It's the area of a rectangle. The base of the rectangle is Q1, and the height of the rectangle is T. That rectangle may increase as we double the size of the tax to 2T. The height of the rectangle will double, but the base of the rectangle will decrease from Q1 to Q2. So the height of our rectangle grows, the base of our rectangle shrinks. Sometimes this could cause an overall increase in the area of the rectangle in more tax revenue. Sometimes it could cause a decrease in the overall area of our rectangle because of the decrease in the base of that triangle. For this instance, as we go from that yellow rectangle to the pink rectangle, giving us total revenue that's raised by a tax of 2T, it appears that a tax of 2T generates more revenue than the yellow rectangle, the original rectangle, representing total revenue at a size of tax T. But it isn't equal to double the original tax revenue. It's increased, but it hasn't doubled. It hasn't kept pace. Our deadweight loss more than doubled, but our total revenue less than doubled. So definitely our tax system here is becoming less efficient as we raise this single tax rate on this single product. And then watch what happens if you carry this forward to the second tax increase, where we triple our original tax and go to a tax rate of 3T or 30 compared to an original tax of 10. So now the tax revenue that we generate has a height of 3 times T. That's the new wedge, the new gap between the buyer price and the seller price. And it has a base of only Q3. As we've reduced the quantity that's bought and sold in this market even further to only Q3, much less than Q2, much less Q1. The area of this blue rectangle is now smaller than the area of the pink rectangle. So we've increased the height of that rectangle but we've decreased the base of that rectangle by so much that the area of the rectangle, the total revenue generated by the tax, is now less. So comparing these three, our tax revenues would have been highest with a tax rate equal to 2t, or 20, and decrease as we increase the tax beyond that point to 3t. This basic idea, it comes from the study in welfare economics of the implications of varying tax rates, is what's illustrated in what we call the Laffer Curve, or by economists of the name Laffer, who became influential in the Reagan administration in the United States in 1980, or at the very least whose ideas became influential. The idea of the Laffer curve is that if we assume straight line supply, straight line demand, or what the elasticities of those curves are, if we make that assumption, as we increase any tax rate, we would see initially that the tax revenue that was raised by that tax would increase, but it would increase at a decreasing rate. And at a decreasing rate until ultimately that tax revenue stopped rising at all as the tax rate would increase. We would have some maximum tax revenue that any tax rate could achieve. Now, Laffer imagined that this might apply to the income tax. That if income taxes were very, very high, they might disincentivize so many people from working, or from working extra hours, something like that, that it would actually cause the revenue that was raised by the income tax to be lower than it otherwise could be. And he hypothesized that if this was the case, and at the time in the United States and many other countries, the top end of the income tax spectrum was very high, could be even a 90% maximum income tax rate. He hypothesized that if this rate were to be lowered to, say, 50%, it could induce more people to work, and so many more people to work, or to work so many more additional hours, that it could lead to an increase in tax revenues. And tax policies were followed in the Reagan years in the 1980s in the United States with this basic idea in mind, lowering the top levels of income tax rates in the hope that this would induce more people to work, or more people to work longer hours, and as a result, increase not only the size of the economy, but increase the amount of tax revenue that was raised from the income tax. Now, this ultimately did not turn out to be the case. This did not work out for the Reagan administration. When they lowered income tax rates, they saw that total tax revenues from the income tax fell. That doesn't mean that there isn't a hypothetical point at which, once we continue to raise the tax rate on any individual good or service or labor or income, we wouldn't begin to see so much additional inefficiency added to the system, so much additional deadweight loss, that tax revenues began to fall. There might still be a hypothetical level for that tax, a hypothetical rate which would give us the maximum tax revenues we could possibly raise. And it's also not necessarily the case, since we still argue that as we raise a rate, we do have exponentially increasing deadweight loss. It's not necessarily the case that we should prefer a tax rate that gives us the maximum possible tax revenue.